Hi guys, so thank you to Jan Pies for recommending this case. It's been a really interesting video to research and make. Also, just generally, I wanted to say hi. Lastly, I tend to say the word quote before repeating something someone said, but I'll drop that moving forward, as I'll be saying it every 2 seconds in this case. If you want me to bring it back in the future, then let me know. Anyway, on with the video. In the early hours of Sunday the 18th of December 1994, a 27-year-old woman called Alison Botha pulled up outside her home in Port Elizabeth, a city in South Africa, unaware that she was being watched by a dangerous predator. In an instant, a normal night turned into the start of a nightmare when a man appeared and held a knife to her throat. Her abductor then picked up his accomplice and they drove to the outskirts of the city. Here, Alison was subjected to a brutal sexual attack before being stabbed multiple times, disemboweling her and having her throat cut to the point where she was almost decapitated. She was then left for dead, but Alison didn't die, and her story is one of unparalleled bravery, in stark contrast to the cowardice of her attackers, Frans and Theuns Kruger, who were dubbed the Ripper Rapists in the press. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Frans Adrien du Toit was born around 1968 and grew up in Jeffreys Bay, a town on the southern coast of South Africa. Du Toit claimed that he was the product of rape, that his biological father, who violated his mother, was never part of his life. It does appear that Du Toit's mother flitted from relationship to relationship with violent men who had abused both of them. He later reported that he saw his mother being assaulted and humiliated both sexually and physically. His mother remarried when he was around 10 years old, and Du Toit was eventually adopted by his new stepfather, who appears to have been a decent man. He worked as a police officer and tried to instill Christian values in the children. However, by this point, the damage was already done, and Du Toit began to show flashes of the monster he was becoming. His mother's marriage and his adoption now meant he had a half-sister, and she would later state that she was regularly raped by Du Toit as a child. At school, Du Toit was lazy, argumentative, and violent, and at around 13 years old, he set fire to a school dormitory and was expelled. At his new school, he was barely present and was more interested in hanging out with gang members and other criminals on the beach. Frans du Toit would later claim that he committed his first rape at the age of 15 years old, with his victim being a 45-year-old woman. He stated that he was a prolific rapist from this point on, committing far more offences than the courts ever knew about, and that he was able to continue to violate women and get away with it because of the culture in the country, which to this day appears to not only ignore sexual violence against women and young girls, but in some cases condones it. I've been shocked by the prevalence of sexual violence in South Africa. It appears from my research that for decades this country has had one of the worst records of sexual violence perpetrated against women in the world. For example, according to a 2009 government survey, 1 in 4 men admitted to having sex with a woman who didn't consent to intercourse, and nearly half of these admitted to raping more than once. The reasons for this rape culture are multiple and too expansive to go into in this video, but it includes misogyny and the normalisation of sexual violence against women, with raping women being seen by some men simply as something that boys do, perfectly normal, literally a hobby, something they do when they're bored. This was even worse in the 1990s, and the courts, as we'll see, dealt with rapists in line with shoplifters. This is when a case even got to court, as this was rare due to a culture of victim blaming. Women brought this on themselves by the way they acted, how they dressed, etc. So unfortunately at the time, Frans du Toit doesn't appear to have been an anomaly. He was much closer to the norm. It was clear that Du Toit had no intention of going straight or contributing anything to society. He briefly joined the army, but spent most of his time in the detention barracks, and then flitted from job to job, usually getting let go because he ended up stealing from his employers. In around 1993, aged 25, Toit set up an unlicensed bar, but his main driver was trawling the streets looking for women to rape, and his hunting ground was the city of Port Elizabeth. On the evening of Friday the 25th of February 1994, a 20-year-old student who we'll call Sarah was sitting in her car outside a pizza parlour in the centre of the city when Toit appeared out of nowhere next to the driver's door. He opened it, pointed a gun at Sarah, and ordered her to move to the passenger seat. He then got behind the wheel and drove away. Sarah started to cry and began talking about herself, trying to get her abductor to see her as a real person in the hope that he wouldn't hurt her. Unfortunately, the man behind the wheel had no humanity. He had done this time and time again, and it showed. He drove with purpose to Norfolk, an isolated seaside town in the Western Cape, and here he raped Sarah at gunpoint. She begged him not to kill her. Toit didn't kill Sarah, but instead, in a truly bizarre moment, took her to a cafe and bought her something to eat. He then sat opposite the woman he just raped and began talking about himself. He spoke about his sister and how he would kill any man who raped her. This is the same half-sister who, as I stated earlier, has come out and reported being sexually abused by Toit when she was a child. However, Sarah's ordeal was not over. She was then driven to a spot near the Pine Lodge holiday resort where she was raped again. Finally, Toit drove back into Port Elizabeth and dropped Sarah off, saying to her, "You're an amazing person, and I hope I can make it up to you sometime." This whole incident is so fucked up and shows the absolute evil and inhumanity of Frans Toit. He abducted and raped a woman, and then, at the end of the ordeal, spoke to her as though they'd just been on a date and he'd forgotten his wallet and she'd had to pay for dinner. He's utterly disconnected from reality. This was clearly one of multiple rapes that Toit committed, but one of only 3 he was convicted of. He should have been stopped in his tracks right here, but the legal system worked in his favour in the most disgusting way. So the month after her ordeal, Sarah went to the police and made a report. Frans Toit was quickly tracked down, arrested and charged with rape. On Tuesday the 15th of March 1994, he appeared in Magistrates Court, where he was released on bail of just R100, equivalent to around £12. So this violent rapist was back on the street, and things would snowball from this point. In June 1994, a man walked into his bar who would become his accomplice. His name was Theuns Kruger. So Theuns Johannes Kruger was born around 1975 and appears to have also come from a broken home. His father abandoned his mother soon after she became pregnant with him, and his stepfather was apparently violent towards all members of the household. Kruger later claimed that he was sexually abused by his stepfather, but his stepfather later came out and denied this and said he would sue to clear his name. So what the truth is unclear. It's also reported that Kruger's mother was not allowed to show affection to her son when the stepfather was around. In school, Kruger was an outcast and bullied and was given the name Three Tit because he had a third nipple. Things got so bad that Kruger later reported constant thoughts of harming himself during his childhood. Theuns Kruger dropped out of school in 1982, aged 17, and joined the army the next year, but only lasted a few months. He then got a job as a security guard, but ended up shooting himself in the foot, leading to several of his toes being amputated, and this further dented his already low self-esteem. Kruger then floated around, hanging out with criminals and descending into alcohol and drug addiction. He was a man later described as having incredibly low self-esteem, someone who felt utterly marginalised, who turned to others, usually older than him, for guidance and support. He was the perfect mark for a more sophisticated criminal, a man who, since he was a teenager, had been raping women, feeling a sense of power and control each time he abused his victims and got away with it. A narcissist and a psychopath who wanted to escalate the brutality of his acts, but he needed an accomplice. When Theuns Kruger walked into the bar, Frans Toit had found what he was looking for, and the pair quickly bonded over the desire to rape and murder, and they would begin a campaign of violence which would result in one woman being disemboweled and almost decapitated. what was actually said between Theuns Kruger and Frans du Toit, which forged their bond and led them to commit the horrific crimes, is unclear. Later, as we'll get to, both made repeated claims about Satanism and being possessed by the devil. But, I'll say it now, as I will later, this is utter bullshit. This was primarily a way to manipulate the courts and get attention. Remember, in all these cases, it's important to strip everything back, cut through the bullshit, and see things for what they are. Ultimately, this was about two evil men who wanted to feel a sense of power and control over women, to decide whether they lived or died. Du Toit had likely been raping women and girls for years. This was entirely normal to him. Having an accomplice would mean that he had someone looking up to him, someone he could teach, feeding into his narcissism. It also likely meant that he would feel emboldened to escalate his crimes to murder, which was clearly his ultimate goal. With Kruger, he inevitably had feelings of hatred towards women because of his previous rejection. He was 19 years old, and Du Toit was 26, so he'd found an older man who could guide him, who told him that he needed to take what he was entitled to. Women were there to be used and abused. They had no right to say no. By raping and killing them, he too could feel powerful, like a god. And so, they decided to engage in a campaign of terror together. This began on Sunday the 4th of December 1994, when a 21-year-old woman, who we'll call Nicole, who was also 3 months pregnant, was attacked. She was walking through the outskirts of Port Elizabeth when she was approached by Frans du Toit, who thrust a gun into her stomach, telling her to shut up and keep quiet. Theuns Kruger was stood a short distance away watching, and as Nicole was frog-marched along, he followed. She was taken to an isolated location nearby, and she was raped, first by Kruger and then by Du Toit. Whilst being raped by Du Toit, Nicole said that it hurt and pleaded that he was injuring her baby. He told her to shut up and ordered Kruger to hold her hands down while he continued. Afterwards, they discussed whether they should kill Nicole or not, and finally decided to let her go. On her way home, she saw a police van, and after flagging it down, she told the officers what had happened. Both Du Toit and Kruger were almost immediately arrested and soon charged with rape. This again should have been the end of the story. Surely the courts would not release these men, especially given that one of them had been charged with rape twice in 9 months. But unbelievably, at their appearance in Magistrates Court on Monday the 5th of December 1994, both men were released on their own recognizance, i.e. they were released on the basis they were likely to turn up to future court appearances. I mean, what the actual fuck? It was later reported that this was a different court than the one Du Toit had appeared at earlier in the year, and the magistrates didn't connect the two cases. But even if this is true, just look at the facts of this case on its own. They abducted a pregnant woman off the street at gunpoint and raped her. I think the way the courts dealt with this pair epitomises the normalised view of rape in South Africa at the time. It was no big thing. It's absolutely disgusting. The pair, especially Du Toit, must have felt invincible. They could abuse women to their heart's content, and no one was going to stop them. And so they went back to their hunting ground, roaming the streets of Port Elizabeth. They were not always successful, and a woman, who we'll call Dawn, had a lucky escape. At around 12:30 p.m, on Friday the 16th of December 1994, Dawn was looking for a parking space outside a friend's flat. She noticed two men watching her, and she felt uncomfortable, but parked up anyway. Frans du Toit then suddenly appeared at her driver's side door, one hand on the door handle and the other on something he was hiding beneath his shirt. He looked away briefly, and Dawn took the opportunity, slamming the door lock down. Du Toit tried the door, and finding it locked, called to Kruger, who was standing across the road, and the pair walked away. They were back combing the streets, looking for a victim the next day, Saturday the 17th of December 1994. As the evening wore on, Kruger was getting despondent and decided to go to a venue called Club Tonight. However, Du Toit was determined to find a woman to rape, so he continued to prowl the streets of Port Elizabeth, and at around 1 a.m. on Sunday the 18th of December 1994, he spotted a woman pulling up in her car. She would be his next victim. Her name was Alison Botha, and her ordeal is like something out of a nightmare. Alison Botha was born in Port Elizabeth on the 22nd of September 1967. Her natural intellect and leadership qualities were quickly recognised by her teachers and nurtured. She became a head girl of Collegiate Girls High School in 1985, and after leaving, Alison studied for a year at the former Port Elizabeth Technikon. At the age of 21, she travelled overseas, living in London for 4 years. She then returned to her home city in 1992 and worked as an insurance broker. Alison, by this point 27 years old, spent Saturday the 17th of December 1994 with friends. She was the designated driver, and after dropping her friends off, she pulled up outside her house in Port Elizabeth at around 1 a.m. on Sunday the 18th of December. The horrifying details of what happened next I take from Alison's book about her ordeal called I Have Life. So Alison had no idea she was being watched and that Frans du Toit, a dangerous serial rapist, was rapidly approaching her vehicle. Alison had turned her head to get her belongings, and when she turned back, the driver's door swung open and she saw a knife, which was quickly held to her throat, with du Toit saying, "Move over, or I'll kill you." He pushed Alison into the passenger seat and started the engine and pulled away, lying to her, saying, "Don't worry, I don't want to hurt you, I just want to use your car for an hour." Du Toit drove to Club Tonight and began combing the streets around the venue, looking for Theuns Kruger, eventually spotting him and waving him over to the car. Du Toit then drove to Nordic and pulled over. There was silence in the car, and this was broken when Alison asked, "Now what?" Frans du Toit turned to her and said, "But I thought you would have realised we want sex." Du Toit forced Alison to perform oral sex on him, holding the knife to her throat, telling her, "If you bite me, I'll kill you." He then performed oral sex on her, asking her, "Does your boyfriend do this to you? Do you like it?" Du Toit then raped Alison in the car, and she could see Theuns Kruger watching. When he was finished, Du Toit asked his accomplice whether he wanted to rape Alison. Kruger responded with profanity, and in a truly bizarre moment, Du Toit admonished him for his language, saying, "Don't speak to her like that, she's a lady." So it was okay to rape Alison, but not to swear in front of her. After Kruger raped Alison, the two discussed what to do with her. One of the pair said that he believed that the devil wants us to kill her. Alison was forced to strip, and Du Toit then placed his hands around her throat and choked her into unconsciousness. Alison was then stabbed 37 times in the abdomen, causing her intestines to spill out, with her attackers deliberately stabbing at her internal organs. They then slashed her throat 16 times. By this point, Alison was starting to regain consciousness and had some awareness of what was going on. She said, "All I could see was an arm moving above my face, left and right, and left and right. His movements were making a sound, a wet sound. It was the sound of my flesh being slashed open. He was cutting my throat with a knife, again and again and again. It felt unreal, but it wasn't. I felt no pain, but it was not a dream. This was happening. The man was slashing my throat." Later, in court, it was reported that Kruger had initially begun to cut Alison's throat, but then Du Toit took the knife and began slashing in a frenzy, again and again. Alison fell to the ground, and she heard her attackers admiring their work and talking about whether she was definitely dead. Alison heard a whistling noise and suddenly realised this was air escaping, not from her mouth, but from her severed windpipe, and she felt the massive hole in her neck, so she calmed herself and slowed her breathing and tried to stay as quiet and still as possible. After a few minutes, she heard the car doors opening, the engine start, and her vehicle being driven away. The pair had taken Alison's rings as trophies of their crime. Alison then opened her eyes, realising she was likely about to die. She decided, "I had to at least leave a clue about who did this to me." She scrawled the name she'd heard her attackers call each other during the journey in the dirt, and beneath this she wrote, "I love Mom." But Alison didn't want to die. She decided she was going to fight until the end, and she saw the headlights of cars at a nearby road streaking past. Alison got to her feet, and at this point she realised the extent of her injuries. Her head, which had been almost decapitated, flopped backwards, and she had to use one of her hands to hold it forward. She reached down and felt something wet, and realised that her small intestines were hanging out of her stomach. Alison pushed them back inside of her and used some of her discarded clothing to hold them in place with her other hand. She then stumbled towards the road. Alison later said, "As I struggled forward, my sight faded in and out, and I fell many times but managed to get up again until I finally reached the road." Alison collapsed across the centre line, hoping she would be seen, and thankfully, a true hero in this case was driving along, and his compassion, kindness, and level-headedness is absolutely remarkable. He was 20-year-old Theuns Ellard, a first-year veteran student who, along with his friends, were on holiday in the Eastern Cape, and they were driving back to their nearby campsite. Theuns' headlights illuminated a bloody mass lying in the road, and as he got closer, to his horror, he realised it was a woman. He later said, "She was lying there, in the middle of the road. She was naked, not a shred of clothing on her body. When I reached her, I realised in horror that her throat had been cut." Theuns took off his jacket and ordered his friends to do the same, and he covered up Alison. Using the knowledge he'd picked up in university, applied pressure to the wound in her neck, holding it shut to stem the bleeding. He later said, "I knew I had to do everything in my power to ensure that the woman remained conscious, as the moment that she started to drift off, she would never open her eyes again. I held her in my arms and kept talking, begging her to take slow breaths." Several frantic phone calls were made to an ambulance, but it would take an hour and 45 minutes for them to arrive. Every second of this time, Theuns held Alison's hand, talking to her, to keep her conscious. He told her that she had a pretty smile and pretty eyes. He complimented her, talked to her, told her stories, trying to make her laugh and smile. Alison couldn't speak, but squeezed his hand. When the ambulance finally arrived, Theuns didn't let go. He held Alison's hand as they sped to hospital. He held her hand while she was being pushed into the emergency room, and literally had to be wrenched from her side as she was wheeled into theatre, but he promised he would be there when she got out of surgery. He kept his promise, and he stayed for days while she recovered. Eventually, he had to go back to Johannesburg and left a parting gift of a cactus and a note saying, "You're the bravest person I've ever met." The pair remain friends to this day. This man is an absolute legend as far as I'm concerned. Going back to when Alison arrived at the hospital, doctors and nurses were horrified by what they saw. Her head was almost decapitated, and her stomach and intestines had been shredded. Dr. Volodya Angelov, a surgeon who worked to save Alison's life, said that her injuries were some of the worst that he'd seen in 16 years of practice, and that the wound to her neck was so severe that her spinal column was clearly visible. The fact that Alison was even alive was a miracle, but her chances of surviving surgery were considered slim. But Alison made it through the first surgery, where her wounds were closed. Due to the risk of infection, Alison was placed in a high care unit and watched continuously. She regained consciousness later the same day, surrounded by her parents, and as I said before, the man who had saved her life, Theuns Ellard. Alison, barely speaking above a whisper, was determined to tell the police what had happened. She realised there was no shame in what she'd been through. It was not her fault. She was a survivor, and she could stop these evil men. A few hours later, still on the same day that she'd been raped and mutilated, a detective was by Alison's bedside, flicking through mugshot books. Without hesitation, she identified her attackers, Frans and Theuns Kruger, and a manhunt began. At around 5 a.m. on Monday the 19th of December 1994, the day after the attack, both men were arrested and hauled in for questioning. The detective who interviewed them, Dr. Melvin Humpel, had a strategy. Neither of the offenders knew that Alison had survived, and he was going to use this information to throw them off balance, to force a confession, and it worked. Both men were cocky during interview, but when they realised that Alison was alive and had identified them, they confessed. Kruger, who had Alison's rings on him when he was arrested, handed them over and gave a full account of attacking her. He also directed the police to the knife which was used to stab Alison and cut her throat. Toit also saw that the writing was on the wall and confessed. Detective Humple later reported that this had nothing to do with remorse, and in fact, he believed that both men were getting off on recounting raping and attempting to kill Alison. The evil of Toit especially was laid bare during the police interview, as he told the detective with a smile on his face that the day after attacking Alison, the pair had been planning to find another woman, and this one they were going to throw off a bridge to make her murder look like their victim had jumped. Both men were charged with offences against Alison, and this time there would be no bail, and on Wednesday the 28th of December 1994, after their appearance at Magistrates Court, they were ordered to be sent to Valkenburg Psychiatric Hospital in Cape Town for 30 days observation. However, only a week later, it was determined that neither Toit or Kruger was suffering from any psychological or psychiatric issue that diminished their responsibility, and they were transferred to prison to await proceedings of the High Court. The details of the court proceedings are a bit contradictory and sparse in reports I've read. However, it appears that both Frans Toit and Theuns Kruger were eventually charged with the rape and attempted murder of Alison, as well as the rape of Nicole, the pregnant woman who'd been attacked on the 4th of December 1994, 2 weeks before Alison was targeted. Frans Toit was also separately charged with the rape of Sarah, who he attacked on his own in February 1994. Both men pleaded guilty to some of the charges, but denied others. In particular, they admitted attempting to kill Alison and raping her, giving lurid details of this, which were read out in court. However, they denied other elements of their offending, such as robbery, which ultimately were clearly lesser offences. This seems to make no sense. Why plead guilty to the most serious offences, but deny more minor crimes? I think this was all a tactic that both men employed. Plead guilty to the most serious offences, so they could get lesser sentences later down the line, but by denying other charges, they forced a trial. They forced their victims to stand up in court and describe what had been done to them. So Toit and Kruger could get their sexual thrill from reliving their crimes and watching their victims being tormented in court, as well as feeling power from seeing the horror in the jury's eyes, but also get a reduced sentence later. Win-win. However, the trial itself, which began on Monday the 12th of June 1995 at the Port Elizabeth Supreme Court, quickly descended into sensationalist farce. The reason for this had occurred before the proceedings had even begun, with the press becoming aware that both men were claiming to be Satanists and that the devil had made them do it. This was again a deliberate strategy that took advantage of something called the Satanic Panic, which began in America in the 1980s and spread across the world throughout the 1990s, becoming more pronounced in areas where there was a strong leaning towards belief in the occult. This included South Africa. This still continues in some form to this day, and includes fear about demonic possession, satanic rituals, etc. It got so bad that occult police units were established in South Africa, which will be relevant in a moment. 4 days before the trial started, Frans Toit, a man charged with multiple rapes, was allowed to hold a press conference where he sat smugly with a slice of cake and a cup of coffee, lecturing about the dangers of Satanism. He reiterated that the devil had made him commit his crimes and that an exorcism had been planned to get rid of his demons. Toit was loving the attention, manipulating all those around him, turning what should have been 3 women's fight for justice into a story about himself. He was the victim, a victim of the devil. Things got even more fucked up during the trial, so a man called Sergeant James Lottering of the Occult-Related Crimes Unit in the Eastern Cape, so a police officer, had organised the exorcism of Toit and had requested that a man called Arthur Frost of the World of Faith Christian Centre conduct it. Both men testified in court that they'd witnessed the exorcism, during which time Toit apparently was thrashing about swearing. Both testified to their belief that Toit had been exorcised and was now a changed man working as a preacher in prison. I mean, I have no words for this. We haven't got into information yet, showing just how depraved and remorseless Frans Toit really was, but the fact that these 2 men, including a police officer, got up on the stand and claimed that because some words were read from the Bible, everything was okay. This man was now fine. The devil made him do it. It's fucking ridiculous. I am, as you can probably tell, straight down the middle, no bullshit. And I've met so many dangerous and depraved people over the years, and it's them who do these things for whatever reason. It doesn't matter if they throw out bullshit about Satan or God or whatever. This is simply pathetic people, often trying to shock or give their horrific acts some sort of spiritual importance, good versus evil. It's all just total bullshit. This world is filled with evil people who do evil things for their own selfish reasons. That is the bottom line. I put as much credibility into someone telling me the devil made them do it as I would someone blaming My Little Pony. Theuns Kruger did not give evidence, but Frans du Toit did, and he continued this conveyor belt of bullshit. He claimed that in 1985, a witch he met in Adelaide conducted a spell which meant that he was possessed by a demon called Incubus. It was Incubus who ordered him to rape women, and it was this entity, and not du Toit himself, who wanted Alison Botha dead. The demon also apparently made him irresistible to women. What that had to do with anything was unclear, but this was likely just dropped in by du Toit to make himself sound amazing. The defence also wheeled out a psychologist called Ian Mayer, who testified that Kruger had empathy with his rape victims and remorse for what he'd done. We'll see just how much remorse he had in a moment. The prosecution were able to cut through the noise. All three victims, Nicole, Alison and Sarah, testified about what they'd gone through, and Dawn, the woman who the pair had tried to abduct less than 48 hours before Alison's ordeal, also gave evidence. They were able to show the utter remorselessness and callousness of both Frans du Toit and Theuns Kruger, using their own confessions against them, and the fact they were clearly planning more acts of rape and murder when they were arrested. They rubbished the defence's claims that both men were now remorseful for what they'd done, and they called out du Toit's bullshit statements about demons. These were two evil predators who had no remorse, whose only intention was to abuse and kill women. At the end of the trial, both du Toit and Kruger were found guilty on all charges, and on Monday the 7th of August 1995, they appeared before Mr. Justice Chris Jansen for sentencing. I do not have a copy of his remarks, only a summary, but he described the pair as extremely dangerous men, and said that their campaign of rape was premeditated and clearly escalating. He had no doubt, if they hadn't been stopped, they would have killed again and again and again. He was unimpressed with du Toit's claims about Satanism, and that the devil made him do it, with him specifically stating it would be a sad day when this religion serves as a mitigating factor. He then sentenced them. For the rape of Sarah, Nicole and Alison, as well as the latter's attempted murder, Frans du Toit was sentenced to life imprisonment. For trying to murder Alison, as well as raping her and Nicole, Theuns Kruger was also sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge specifically directed that he wanted his sentencing remarks attached to each man's prison record, with him making it explicit that he wanted both offenders to remain in prison for the rest of their lives. Showing how much empathy and remorse he actually felt, as the sentence was passed, Kruger punched a wall and said, "Well, here we go, fuck you all," before he was taken down. That should have been that, but despite the obvious danger of du Toit and Kruger, and the words of the judge, these two dangerous men would eventually be back in the community, and the decision making by the authorities and the appalling way the victims were treated is truly staggering. In this section, I'll focus predominantly on Frans du Toit, as information on Theuns Kruger's time in prison is scant. However, it's clear, as we'll return back to in the profile section of this video, that du Toit was the leader of this inhuman pair, the more disturbed and dangerous of the two, but that is ultimately like comparing two separate shades of shite. Unfortunately, despite the judge at the sentencing hearing making it clear that he wanted both men in prison forever, it appears that due to a later change in legislation, all prisoners sentenced to life imprisonment prior to October 2004 were eligible for parole. The first time that Frans du Toit and Theuns Kruger were eligible for parole was in 2015. It's reported that Alison Botha had in late 2014 reported to the prison that du Toit had access to a mobile phone and internet access, and he was posting on social media. He had also apparently formed an online relationship with a woman in America, and she'd reached out to Alison to share the content of these conversations, which were deeply disturbing. In them, he stated that he was a leader in the Numbers gang, a South African criminal organisation believed to be present in most South African prisons, and that from this position he'd organised for one woman to be gang raped, and that he had another woman raped when she accused him of killing her father. In addition, Alison was a frequent topic of his grievances. He called her a bitch, someone who thought the sun shines out of her ass, that she should have died, and that she needed therapy, as she obviously hasn't recovered from the ordeal. Just a reminder, this monster raped, disemboweled, and almost decapitated this woman. When Alison made her report to the prison, she made it very, very clear that she didn't want anyone to know where this information had come from. But despite this, for some reason, her full complaint was given directly to Toit. This increased his online mocking towards her, and his internet access was not taken away. All of this obviously increased the risk to Alison if he did in fact have contacts on the outside. Parole was denied for both men, but they were allowed to reapply every 2 years. Each time, Alison would write to the parole board, begging for them not to be released, with good reason. These men were serial killers in the making. It didn't take a degree in psychology to see that. We then go to March 2021, when a new report was commissioned, completed by a clinical psychologist who interviewed Toit and undertook extensive research. The content of this report showed that Frans Toit, by this point 54 years old, was still as dangerous as ever, and his statements were both alarming and disgusting. He made it clear that had he and his accomplice not been caught, they would have gone on a murder and rape spree. He disclosed that he'd raped multiple women since the age of 15, far more than the authorities knew about. The report identified how previously Toit had been assessed as being a narcissist and a psychopath, and he continued to present himself in a grandiose manner, claiming again to be the head of a prison gang and formerly a member of a special forces unit in the army. Out of the 22 risk factors which the psychologist identified as indicating a risk of further reoffending, Toit demonstrated 20 of them. As we'll get to, Alison Botha turned her ordeal into a positive and released a book about her experience. However, Toit appeared to want to take credit for this. He said that had he not raped Alison, she would not have written this book, which potentially saved thousands of other women from being raped. I mean, how twisted is that logic? He also claimed that he'd given one of his victims more sexual pleasure than a male partner. Lastly, despite previously clearly indicating that both he and Kruger had cut Alison's throat repeatedly, he now said that he just pricked her with the knife to check if she was dead. The report concluded that Frans Toit was a high risk of reoffending, and that he presented with a lack of empathy and had superficial remorse for the consequences of his criminal actions. Despite this report, which would have been one of the most damning, I'm sure, the psychologist had ever written, after a 45-minute parole hearing, including a break, in June 2023, the parole board recommended both the release of Frans Toit and Theuns Kruger. This was then endorsed by then Justice and Correctional Services Minister Ronald Lamola, and on Tuesday the 4th of July 2023, both men walked free, having served 28 years in prison. This decision was made without consulting Alison, or even telling her that the pair had been released. I keep focusing on Alison, but it's important to remember the other victims. I have no doubt they also had no say in the parole decision, and were not told that the men who subjected them to horrific sexual attacks were now free. There was outrage in South Africa when this was reported, but it would take until February 2025 and a new minister for someone to see sense, and Toit and Kruger's parole was reversed, and they were arrested and returned to prison. Hopefully, they stay there for the rest of their lives. I mean, I've covered so many stupid decisions on this channel, made by people who we put our faith in to protect us, but this one is either number one or in the very least the top 3. You have a diagnosed psychopath who essentially told a psychologist, "I see nothing wrong with what I did and I will do it again," and his accomplice, who likely also fits this same mould, and you let them out. I have no doubt that both men independently and together committed more crimes over the 19 months they were back in the world. Maybe these women have been too afraid to come forward, or unfortunately, more likely, they're dead. Their blood is on the hands of the parole board and Ronald Lamola. I have a horrible feeling the names Frans Toit and Theuns Kruger will be back in the news again, linked to unsolved murders and rapes crisscrossing South Africa. Alison Botha, initially surviving her attack, was just the start of her recovery. Her ordeal had left her with deep psychological and physical scars. In the days after the attack, Alison described being in excruciating, mind-blowing pain. Her wounds had to be cleaned daily, which was agony. When she began to start walking again, it felt like she was walking through fire, and she felt that her intestines wanted to burst out of her abdomen. Eventually, she left hospital and was looked after by her mother, but Alison soon sunk into a deep depression. One day, she stood in front of the mirror, looking at her abdomen, which was a mass of scars, and said, "Look at me, who will love me this way?" Alison returned to her old life, but found everything was different. She was different. She wasn't happy anymore. She wrote in her diary, around 3 months after the attack, "My stomach is painful all the time. All the time. The pain never goes away. I'm so tired of it. So tired of being someone who has to deal with this. I just want to be normal, like I was before. I feel different from everyone else, and they treat me that way. Everyone is careful around me." Alison was plagued with nightmares and constantly feared that her attackers would track her down and finish the job. She became more and more depressed and was beginning to give up on life. But again, demonstrating her immense bravery, she decided that she wasn't done and that she would fight. Alison decided to turn her horrific experience into a positive. She was going to tell rape survivors that they did not need to hide their experience. They had done nothing wrong. She was determined to break down the notion that women were the ones at fault for being raped. She contacted a national newspaper called You, asking them to tell her story, and they agreed. After this, the offers came in. Radio, TV. She even held her own press conferences. All of this to try and help other women get justice. But behind the scenes, Alison was still struggling. She was still depressed. But then, she met a man called Theuns. They'd known each other some years before, but reconnected after the ordeal. The two soon began a relationship, and in June of 1996, Theuns asked for her hand in marriage, and the pair got married in February 1997. One of the things that was unclear was whether the injuries Alison suffered would stop her from having children, but to her delight, in 2003, she became a mother, giving birth to her first son, Daniel. In 1998, a book about Alison's ordeal and survival was published, called I Have Life, and she spent the next 3 decades travelling to over 30 countries around the world, lecturing and supporting women, sharing her story of survival, inspiring others to come forward to tell their stories of abuse to the authorities and to others to begin the healing process. I want to play some of an interview that Alison gave in 2016, just to illustrate how amazing this woman is.
During the break, I thought to myself, I wanted to know what was that moment of commitment that happened, that took place, where when you were crawling and you had a choice between life and death, and you were going for life. What made you decide this was worth it and I'm going to do it? Was there a distinct moment?
For me, there were two. One was even before I started crawling, because they drove off and left me there for dead. And there was a moment, and I hadn't moved yet, and I lay there, and I remember, it's hard to put into words because it's a spiritual moment in a way, because I remember actually being above my body.
Well, it has to be.
And so there are no words for us that in our dictionary that describes a moment like this. We normally don't have that in our human experience. But I just remember, the best I can describe it, I was above her, because I remember looking at her and feeling sorry for her. But at the same time, I did intrinsically know it was me, and I knew I had a choice, and whichever choice I made was going to be okay. I wasn't going to be judged for it. And I think, in a way, for me, that I don't want death to happen now, but I don't fear it in a way. I know when it happens, it's going to be part of the process, and it's going to be okay for all of us, I think. Yeah. But there was another moment. Then I did go back in my body, and I did try and crawl. And then, after crawling maybe 5 meters, I collapsed. And it was at that moment I just wanted it to be over. I wanted to die, and there was something, obviously, that same spiritual self inside myself that I remember just knowing I was worth getting up for. I couldn't die. I couldn't die like this. I couldn't die now, not at their hands, in a way, you know. So there were a lot of elements there, but I remember that was when I thought I have to get up. Yeah. Wow. And from that moment of getting up, that was when, you know, it wasn't easy, but I didn't once again want to die after that. You know.
And you lived to tell the story and, of course, share with so many other people across the world. And I think that message has been so strong. You've been one of the first females in South Africa to be so vocal about rape. What advice would you give to women to protect themselves? What can we do to protect ourselves? And should it happen to a woman, how can we be vocal about it in a way that we don't have to. I think this is because I think it happens to some women and they just want to hide behind and not tell anybody and just kind of break
it's horrific
down.
that we live in a country where we even have to ask, what if it were to happen?
I know.
Yeah.
Or a world.
Yeah.
But also, do you know how many young girls it happens to? And then they're ashamed. They feel maybe it was their fault.
Their
and then
fault.
they don't
Oh,
tell
no, Jeannie,
anybody about it.
I have people after my talks when I share, I think because I share so openly, it gives people the permission to do the same to me. And people come up, I have many who come up to me and say, Alison, I've never told anybody this but, and then they will tell me something, that they've never told their husband of like 30 years, but that they were raped as a child. I had the other day a lady who was raped by a brother's friend when she was 13. She's now in her 40s. Now to me, okay, I can't get, if each situation is different, each person is different, it's not to look at me and say, well, she did that, I must do the same. But to keep it to yourself, it will demand attention of you at some part in your life. And to me, even if you find a stranger, a priest, a counselor, a whatever you feel comfortable with, talk about it to someone. What I've found is the sharing has been my healing. Knowing that I'm helping someone maybe in sharing my story and it might help them means some good is coming out of a bad situation, and they might find the same just in their circle.
And you have to, don't you get so angry, when you hear about stories like this Brock Turner now in America, who raped this girl, and then, I don't know if you know the story, but then said, but you know, it's going to damage his swimming career, it's going to damage his amazing Stanford
For 30 minutes of action.
And for 30 minutes of action, and then saying, she can't remember it anyway, maybe she wanted it. I mean, I'm furious. This is sometimes why some girls think, maybe I don't have a voice, maybe I can't say anything about what's happening to me.
You know, the society, the things that we have to fight for in society is for the victims to actually get the attention, the help along the way, that they know they come forward, that they're going to be looked after. Because so many times you hear the stories where the victims they're brave enough to come forward, and then the system, excuse the pun, but it rapes them again.
Exactly.
And they feel, and then their stories stop all the others from coming forward because they say, well, I don't want that to happen to me. So then they'd rather not, come forward. So there's a lot to be done.
Yeah, your story has certainly grown lots of wings. It's now become a documentary film, which recently showed at the Durban Film Festival. What did you feel like watching the film?
I'm preferring it now that I've seen it a few times, because the first time, you girls are used to being on TV and screen, but the first time I was like, oh no, really?
You never get used to yourself.
So that was my first reaction. So everyone was expecting me to give this sort of like emotional reaction, but mine was just, oh no, really? So the more times I've watched it, I've been able to enjoy the story of the movie. And Ugo Carlini, who is the director here based in Cape Town, who I chose, has done it so well, because it's a hybrid film is what we call it, because it's got elements of documentary with me speaking, which people actually appreciate. They want to hear it from me. But also the different characters who played a part. The Tian, who found me on the road. Present day Tian is there, the judge, the doctor, various people like that are in the movie. But then there's elements of feature in that there's a reenactment scenes, which is not me. And there's elements of animation even. It's along those lines of a fairy tale in that I start off by opening a book and saying, well, this is my story. And it's not always the happy ending that we are told as little girls, It's not always going to be that, but it's okay. And we make up our story as we go, and that's kind of so it's a very watchable movie. Yes, it's about a horrific incident, but people feel inspired when they walk out, and that's what we wanted.
And of course you have a book.
I do.
And the film rights as well.
Yes, well, the book has got, this is actually an updated version. This book was published in 1998. Marianne Tam wrote it with me, but it's now got an updated, because it's been a while since it was published, and it's been a while since the story happened. So this just has got a catch-up chapter written by me, which is a catch-up to present day.
I'm very curious to know how your children react to your story, and what do you think they take from it every time they...
Yeah, I think they're proud of me as mommy and what I do, and they know I go off and do talks. They haven't never been, and they won't see the movie yet because it's going to be too traumatic. But I've used it in the way I want to bring them up. I've used, the things that my mother taught me is what has helped me live, let alone, and obviously recover. And those things of valuing yourself and believing in yourself, and no matter what happens, we choose what we do, all those things. And that's what I want to bring my boys up with. So they need to know about the story.
So you have boys.
I do. I have
the irony
boys.
of that.
See, I take it very seriously that I need to bring up men who are going to be part of making that difference, of not being the men who are going to make the littles flippant. And you might think it's, you get together with your friends in a bar and there's a flippant comment about a woman walking past, and fantastic grade. It diminishes. It is what society's the problem is.
Exactly.
Those are the gross levels that we need to change.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being on the show. You are incredibly inspiring, and I wish you the best on your journey.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here.
Thank you so much.
Unfortunately, Alison was back in the news more recently due to fighting for her life after suffering a brain aneurysm in September 2024, which required brain surgery. In the most recent update, from July 2025, Alison is recovering and on the mend. People opened their hearts and wallets to ensure that she had enough money to keep a roof over her head and to pay for her medical expenses. Honestly, I read the articles about the brain aneurysm first and my heart sank. I was so worried that I was going to read that Alison had passed away. Genuinely, when I saw that she was still alive, I was so happy. This woman refuses to quit, and I admire her so much. She went through an ordeal that I cannot even imagine, and she could easily have laid down and given up. But she didn't. She spent the night fighting for her life, and has spent the last 30 years ensuring that the cowards who attacked her did not win. I've no doubt that when she's fully fit, Alison will go back to inspiring and supporting young women, giving them hope and showing them there is life after trauma. I would ask all of you to pray for Alison's speedy recovery. We need far more people like her in the world. I must always talk about the childhoods of the offenders, as it's there where their evolution to the monsters they become starts, and that is again true in the case of Frans du Toit and Theuns Kruger. However, we need to consider something wider, the environment they grew up in. To be clear, I'm not trying to portray all South African men as the same. The stat I mentioned earlier about 1 in 4 men raping someone before they were 18 obviously indicates that 75% of the male population do not engage in this disgusting behaviour. But it's important to have honest conversations about issues despite people potentially getting offended, otherwise nothing changes. Also, don't think I'm talking from some sort of lofty position. The UK has many issues which need addressing, including violence against women. Anyway, with regards to this case, Frans du Toit was clearly one of the quarter of the male population who raped before he was 18. I think it was likely around similar people who had done this, and it completely normalised his already twisted view of women and their role in society. So he mentioned his father abusing his mother. If he had seen this as he was growing up, this would have taught him that was all women were good for. He clearly had no empathy for women. I don't think he even considered them human. So if he was exposed to this type of thinking outside the home, then you have someone who would have grown up thinking that sexually violating women was the norm, just something you do. His normalised views of rape are staggering and shown by his actions. For example, Sarah, who he took to dinner after raping her. He violated this woman, then went and bought her something to eat, as well as a rose, before driving her to another location and raping her again, before saying she was amazing and he wanted to make it up to her sometime. He was acting like they'd just been on a date, and I think this is how du Toit saw things. He could go out with a woman, rape her, and then bashfully at the end of the night say, "So, how about a second date?" The same with his behaviour with Alison. He was fine raping her and cutting her throat, but using profanity in front of a lady was a big no-no. Frans du Toit is one of those people who knows that something is against the law in principle, but has absolutely no idea why. He knows that people go to prison for rape, but he doesn't agree with this, or understand the lifelong impact this has on his victims, as shown by his statements more recently, where he believed Alison should just get over it. Whilst he may not have understood this, he definitely grasped the power that he felt from raping women. The thing to remember with offences like this is that it's not just the act itself which gives these men a sense of superiority, it's everything before it as well. Scouring the streets, abducting a woman and having absolute power over her, or seeing a woman and not targeting her, but thinking in their head, "I allowed you to go, you have no idea what I could have done to you." For want of a better term, it's the thrill of the hunt, people not knowing that they're walking past a predator, and du Toit did this time and time again. He was convicted of 3 rapes, but the number is likely 10, 20, 30 times this. He clearly had a method, surprising women as they parked their cars, and had chosen a location near the coast to commit the rapes. Theuns Kruger, I think, was cut from the same cloth, but with certain differences. He likely was also exposed to rape culture and had an extremely poor view of women, but his hatred of them was more personal, the fact that he was always rejected. meeting Toit gave him an outlet for his anger. He was taught how to turn the table on women, a way to make them fear him, no longer pity him. You can see the teacher-pupil role in their offending, Toit taking the lead, whilst Kruger stood on watching. I imagine that Toit literally sat Kruger down like he was in a lecture hall and gave a presentation on the best way to target, abduct and rape women. Toit would have been in heaven. Not only was he a serial rapist of women, but he now had a young acolyte hanging on his every word. How important was he? I have no doubt that it was Toit who brought up the idea of not only raping but killing women. Having an accomplice would have given him greater opportunities. He now had someone who could help him dispose of the body. Also, as he now had this new accomplice, I think he wanted to show off, look what I can do, aren't I amazing? However, underpinning all of this was still his desire for ultimate power and control. At his whim, a woman would live or die. They both fed off each other. There is no question that had they not been caught, they would have raped and murdered countless women. This is why the decision to release them is so despicable. There are some cases where the risk is nuanced. Something that someone says strikes a chord, and you need training and expertise to understand why that's relevant. But with Frans Toit, he might as well have had a fucking sign saying, "I'll do it again." Anyone could have read his case file and decided that he should die in prison. So why the parole board and a member of government decided to release them is beyond me. This is also why I'm sure, unfortunately, that in the 19 months they were in the community, they created more victims. Of course they did. It's almost as if people in authority do not understand criminals and criminal behaviour, which is really weird and really worrying. Like I said, I don't think we've heard the last of Frans Toit and Theuns Kruger and the other horrors they've committed. So what are your thoughts on this case? If you like the content, then consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button. You can also send a one-off donation to support the channel via the thanks button. I'm working really hard to try and get the channel to 100,000 subs, so please like, share, and most importantly subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.